a man can be a territory of ruin. Not a city with its ghosts of commerce and society, but a vast and silent territory, conquered by a past that has salted the earth and poisoned the wells. Elias was such a place. His ranch was the map of his soul, a geography of loss written in dust and decay. The fences slumped like weary shoulders, surrendering their dominion to thistle and wind. The barn, a great skeletal cathedral, held only echoes and the dry rustle of forgotten things. And the house, the heart of this desolate land, had ceased to beat. Its windows were clouded with a cataract of grime, and inside, dust lay upon every surface not as a temporary visitor, but as a permanent shroud, burying the memory of a woman's touch, of a child's laughter, under a soft, grey silence. Elias moved through this ruin as a spectre might haunt its own grave, his presence defined only by absence. He was a tall man, built of the same tough, weathered material as the fence posts, but something inside him had broken, leaving him hollow. His hands, which had once known the intimate language of soil and animal, were now perpetually still, resting on the table or hanging at his sides as if they had forgotten their purpose. He ate, he slept, he existed. But he did not live. His days were measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the warped floorboards, a silent, indifferent witness to his self-imposed sentence. Into this profound stillness, a noise intruded. It was the profane rattle of a pickup truck, a sound of the outside world he had long since banished. It coughed and sputtered its way up the long, neglected drive, its engine a vulgar shout in the library of his grief. Elias watched from the clouded window, his face impassive, a statue observing an act of desecration. The truck stopped, and a man named Jed climbed out, a man whose smile was a crack in a dirty plate. Jed was a purveyor of the cheap and the broken, a trader in misfortune, and his presence on the ranch was a stain. He swaggered to the passenger side and pulled the door open. A woman was pushed out. She was small, and the worn fabric of her dress was stretched taut over the unmistakable swell of a child. Her face was a mask of stoic endurance, her black hair pulled back tightly, but her eyes held a deep, ancient weariness. She stood beside the truck, a solitary, defiant figure against the vast, empty canvas of the plains. Jed ambled to the porch, his boots scuffing up clouds of protest from the dust. "Even trade, Elias," he called out, his voice thick with a greasy fellowship Elias had never invited. "That debt you been carrying." The one from your pa wiped clean. Elias did not move, did not speak. His silence was a wall, but Jed treated it like an open door. "Got her from a crew down at the port. Fresh off the boat. Quiet one. Won't give you no trouble." Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Bit of a surprise in the package, but hell, think of it as a bonus. You always was one for strays." The words were a wicked joke, a shard of glass meant to pierce the thick hide of his sorrow. Elias knew the debt was a fiction, a flimsy pretext. This was cruelty for its own sake, a spectacle for Jed's own vacant amusement. He was being handed another piece of brokenness, a human reflection of his own blighted land, a final, mocking testament to his ruin. The woman's eyes flickered toward him for a single, fleeting moment. There was no plea in them, no fear, only a profound and unnerving stillness that mirrored his own. Jed gave her a rough shove toward the porch. "She's yours now." "Good luck," he laughed again as he climbed back into his truck, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. The truck rattled away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a silence that was now heavier, occupied. The woman stood where Jed had pushed her, her small bag clutched in her hands. She did not look at the house. She did not look at him. She looked out at the horizon, as if measuring the scale of her new prison. Elias remained behind the glass, a man of stone. He had not asked for this. He had not agreed. He was the sovereign of this wasteland, and she was an invader, another ghost to share his haunting. He did not invite her in. He simply turned from the window and retreated into the shadows of his house, leaving her to the mercy of the wind and the dying light. He expected her to be gone by morning. He expected she would take her chances with the open road, with the coyotes and the endless miles, rather than stay in a place so thoroughly conquered by death. When the sun rose, casting long, accusing fingers across the floor, he went to the window. She was still there. She had not moved to the porch. She had sat down on the ground, her back against a wheel of the broken-down buckboard that had been rotting by the drive for a decade. She had slept there, curled into herself, a small, resilient knot of life in the face of overwhelming emptiness. For 3 days, they existed in this state of silent opposition. He remained in the house, she remained outside. He ate his canned beans cold, he did not know or care what she did. He was waiting for her to break, to leave, to surrender to the desolation as he had. But she did not. On the 4th morning, something changed. She rose, and with a slow, deliberate grace, she walked to the water pump. Her movements were careful, conserving an energy that had to be finite. She worked the rusted handle, her slight frame straining with the effort. A groan of metal on metal, a death rattle from the pipes below, and then, a miraculous trickle of brown, silted water. She pumped until it ran clear, then cupped her hands and drank. After that, she found a bucket, scoured it with sand and water, and carried it to the porch. She took a piece of cloth from her bag and began to wash the window he always stood behind. It was a small act, an absurd gesture in the face of so much neglect. The grimy pane was a single square in a vast quilt of decay. Yet she cleaned it with a focused, methodical patience, her small hand moving in slow, circular motions. Elias watched, a strange feeling stirring in the pit of his stomach. It was not anger. It was a disquieting sense of being seen. She was not cleaning the window for herself. She was cleaning it for him, so that he could better see out. So that the world could better see in. He did not acknowledge it. He retreated from the window, as if the small patch of clarity was too bright, too intrusive. But he could not escape the act. It was a statement. I am here. This place can be clean. He left a can of peaches on the porch rail that evening, a gesture so subtle it was almost an accident. He did not see her take it. The next morning, the can was gone, and an empty, clean tin was sitting in its place. A silent transaction. A language of objects. The days that followed found their own rhythm. He would watch her, a silent observer from the shadows of his home, as she waged a quiet, one-woman war against the entropy of his life. She mended the torn screen on the door with thread pulled from her own hem. She swept the porch, a Sisyphean task against the ceaseless wind, yet she did it every morning. She gathered fallen branches and stacked them into a neat pile, an act of order in a world of chaos. She did not ask for tools. She did not ask for help. She simply used what she found at her hands, her inexhaustible patience, a shard of metal to scrape away lichen, a sturdy stick to beat dust from a rug she dragged from the house. He never saw her enter the house itself, only take things from it that were stained or broken and bring them into the light to be cleansed or mended. He began to leave things for her. An old bar of soap. A needle and thread. A worn-out whetstone. He never handed them to her. He would place them on the porch before dawn, and they would be gone when he next looked. He learned her name was mine not from her voice, for he had not yet heard it, but from a small, embroidered character on the corner of her bag. My. It felt like a secret he had stolen. The territory of his ruin was being subtly reshaped by this silent gardener. She was not demanding he heal, she was simply pulling the weeds. One afternoon, he watched as she stood before the plot of earth beside the house. It had once been his wife's garden, a riot of color and life that had been the first thing to die after she did. Now it was a hard, cracked scar of land, studded with rocks and pale, stubborn weeds. Mai stood there for a long time, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her head tilted as if listening to something deep in the soil. Elias felt a cold spike of memory, a ghost of pain so sharp it almost made him cry out. Leave it alone, he thought, a silent command. That place is not for you. That place is a tomb. But she did not hear his thoughts. She knelt, the movement slow and difficult, and began to work. With her bare hands, she pulled at the largest of the weeds. Then she used a flat stone to break up the top layer of the compacted earth. It was brutal, punishing work. The sun beat down with a merciless, white-hot intensity, the air thick and still. He watched her for an hour, her back bent, her face beaded with sweat. He saw her pause, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and press a hand to her side. A part of him, the ruined part, wanted her to fail. It wanted the earth to resist her, to prove that some things were too broken to ever be fixed. But another part, a part he thought long dead, felt a reluctant stirring of something other than grief. It was a flicker of shame. He was a man of the land, and he was watching a pregnant woman break her back to reclaim a piece of it while he stood by like a coward. He turned and went into the barn. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and time. He moved through the gloom, his boots disturbing the sleep of a century of dust. In the corner, leaning against the wall where he had thrown it years ago, was a spade. The wooden handle was grey and splintered, the metal head a uniform crust of orange rust. It was the tool he had used to dig his wife's grave. He had never touched it since. His hands trembled as he took it. The weight of it was the weight of his entire past. He carried it out into the blinding sunlight, his eyes squinting. Mai was still on her knees, her progress a pathetic, small patch of turned earth. He walked to the edge of the dead garden, and without a word, without looking at her, he thrust the spade into the ground, leaving it standing upright like a lonely cross. Then he turned and walked back to the house. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was charged with the meaning of the spade. He watched from the window as she finally saw it. She stared at it for a long moment, then slowly got to her feet. She approached it cautiously, as if it were a wild animal. She ran a hand over the rusted metal, then grasped the splintered handle. She pulled it from the earth, and with a small, determined grunt, she put her foot to its shoulder and drove it back into the ground. A clean, sharp sound of metal slicing through soil. It was the first sound of true work the ranch had heard in years. The sound of something beginning. From that day on, a fragile partnership was forged in the crucible of silence. While she tilled and cleared the garden patch, he began to mend the fence that surrounded it. He replaced the rotten posts, stretched new wire until it hummed with tension. He worked at a distance from her, the space between them still a chasm of unspoken things, but they were now working in concert. He would find his tools cleaned and set neatly aside at the end of the day. He would leave a full canteen of fresh water by the garden gate each morning. The oppressive heat of summer began to build, the sky a vast, empty bowl of blue steel. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the promise of a storm that refused to break. As Mai's belly grew, so did the garden. She had found a small packet of seeds in her bag, and tiny green shoots, impossibly brave, were now pushing their way through the reclaimed soil. They were a testament to her faith, a green prayer offered up to the hostile sky. One evening, as the horizon began to bruise with the colors of dusk, Elias stood looking at the mended fence, the neat rows of fledgling plants. He felt a phantom sensation in his chest, a ghost of a feeling he vaguely recognized as peace. It was fragile, easily startled, but it was there. Mai came and stood a few feet away, her hands clasped over her belly. They stood together, watching the last of the light fade. She turned her head and looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. Her eyes were not empty. They held the quiet strength of the seed she had planted, the deep knowing of the earth itself. And for the first time since she had arrived, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper against the vastness of the plains. Thank you. The two words were a stone dropped into the deep well of his silence, the ripples spreading out to touch every corner of his ruined territory. He did not know how to respond. He simply nodded, a stiff, awkward gesture. It was enough. The peace was shattered by the same sound that had brought her. The profane rattle of Jed's truck. This time it sounded different. More aggressive. It tore up the drive and skidded to a halt, churning the dirt into a frenzy. Jed was not alone. Another man sat beside him, bigger and hard-looking, with a face like a clenched fist. Elias felt an old, cold instinct uncoil in his gut. The instinct of a man protecting his land. He moved to stand slightly in front of Mai, a small, almost unconscious shift of his body. Jed swung out of the truck, his smile gone, replaced by a sneer of ownership. All right, Elias. Fun's over. Got a better deal lined up for her. He jerked his chin toward me, not even looking at her, as if she were a piece of livestock. Some miners up north. Paying the double what your PA's phony debt was worth. The other man got out and stood by the truck, cracking his knuckles. He was there for enforcement. The storm that had been threatening for weeks chose that moment to arrive. The wind picked up, whipping dust into their faces. The sky darkened ominously, and a low rumble of thunder echoed from the horizon. It was the world mirroring the violence that was about to unfold. "She's not for sale," Elias said. His own voice sounded strange to him, rusted from disuse but hard as the spade's iron. Jed laughed, a short, ugly bark. "She was never yours to begin with. She's mine. Bought and paid for. Now get out of the way before my friend here moves you." My hand found the back of Elias's shirt, a small, trembling grip. He could feel her fear, and it was like pouring gasoline on the embers of his rage. He had spent years in a state of surrender, letting grief have its way with him. He had let his land fall to ruin, his house to dust, his soul to silence. But this small, silent woman had come and patiently, painstakingly, started to mend things. She had cleaned his window. She had resurrected his wife's garden. She had given him back a reason to pick up a tool. She and the child she carried were the first green shoots in the wasteland of his heart. "She stays," Elias said. The words were not a request. They were a declaration. A line drawn in the dirt. Jed's face twisted in disbelief, then rage. "You gone soft, old man." He took a step forward, his hand reaching for mine. He never touched her. Elias saw the hand, a grubby, profane thing reaching for the one fragile piece of hope in his world. And the stillness in him, the great, heavy inertia of his grief, shattered into a million pieces. He moved faster than he had in years. His fist, hardened by a lifetime of labor, connected with Jed's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. Jed staggered back, spitting blood and a curse. The big man lumbered forward, but Elias was no longer a man of ruin. He was a guardian. He was a force of nature, as elemental as the coming storm. He met the man's charge, using his momentum against him, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The fight was not a brawl, it was an execution. It was brutal, primal, and blessedly short. Elias fought with the ferocity of a man who had nothing, and who had just been reminded he had everything to lose. He used his fists, his elbows, the hard ground itself. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering the dust. When it was over, Elias stood, breathing heavily, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The big man was groaning on the ground, and Jed was scrambling back to his truck, his face a mask of fear and pain. "You're crazy!" Jed shrieked, his voice thin against the rising howl of the wind. "You're both crazy!" He threw himself into the cab, and the truck roared to life, spitting gravel as it fishtailed back down the drive, disappearing into the sheets of rain. The storm broke in earnest. A torrential, cleansing downpour that washed the blood from the dirt and the dust from the air. Elias stood in the deluge, letting it soak him to the bone. He was battered, bruised, but he felt more alive than he had in a decade. Mai came to him, her face streaked with rain and tears. She reached out and took his bloody hand, her small fingers gently examining the broken skin. She led him to the porch, out of the worst of the rain, and for the second time, she entered the house. She returned with a basin of water and a clean cloth. Silently, she began to wash the wounds on his hands. Her touch was gentle, reverent. In that moment, with the storm raging around them, a new covenant was sealed. Not with words, but with water and care. The baby was born 3 weeks later, as the last of the summer heat gave way to the crisp promise of autumn. It was a boy, small and perfect, with his mother's dark eyes. Elias held him, the tiny, warm weight in his arms a profound anchor, grounding him in the present. The ruin had been reclaimed. The territory was no longer desolate. The fences were strong, the barn was clean, and the house was a home, filled not with the ghosts of what was lost, but with the quiet, powerful presence of what had been found. The garden, Mai's garden, was a riot of life, yielding squash and beans and corn, a bounty from the earth she had healed with her own hands. Elias was no longer a man of ruin. He was a husband, a father, a guardian of the green shoots. He was a man who had been taught, by a silent woman and a newborn child, that the most broken ground can be made to live again. All it takes is for someone to be brave enough to plant a single seed. We are often told that healing is a loud and declarative act, a triumphant battle cry against our demons. But this story suggests something quieter, something more profound. It whispers that sometimes, the most powerful force for change is not a shout, but a steady, silent presence. It is the quiet dignity of a woman weeding a dead garden, the unspoken promise in a clean windowpane, the gentle weight of a mended fence. It shows us that a heart, like a piece of land, can lie fallow for years, salted by grief and overgrown with the thorns of the past. It can feel so utterly ruined that the only logical thing to do is abandon it. But what if redemption isn't about bulldozing the old landscape? What if it's about the patient, thankless work of clearing one small patch of ground? Of planting one small seed of hope and tending to it, even when the sky is merciless and the earth is hard as stone? The rancher's soul was a reflection of his ranch, and it was not his own strength that saved him. He was saved by the courage of another. He was healed because he was finally given something to protect, something more precious than his own sorrow. Ask yourself, what are the ruined territories in your own life, or in the lives of those around you? What small, silent act of mending could you perform today? You may not see the results immediately. The work may be hard and the ground resistant. But in the act of caring for another, in the selfless gesture of tending to someone else's garden, we often find the seeds of our own salvation. The greatest miracles are not the ones that shake the earth, but the ones that quietly, patiently, make it bloom again. Thank you for watching.